In the 12th century before our era, the Mediterranean was not a scattering of isolated kingdoms. It was a single breathing system. Ships moved between its shores carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from lands beyond the horizon, ivory, glass, grain, and gold. Kings who never met one another called each other brother in letters written on clay. A merchant in Ugarit could load his ship with goods bound for Egypt, for Crete, for the Hittite heartland, and trust that the roads of the sea would carry him safely there and back again. This was a world built on connection, on the fragile understanding that trade must continue, that palaces must be supplied, that the machinery of civilization must keep turning. At the center of this machinery stood the great powers of the age. Egypt, ruled by pharaohs who saw themselves as living gods, controlled the Nile and reached northward into Canaan. The Hittite Empire commanded the highlands of Anatolia, its armies feared from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Mycenaean Greece, with its fortress palaces and warrior aristocracy, ruled the western waters, and scattered among them were smaller kingdoms and city-states, Ugarit chief among them, whose archives would one day reveal to us just how tightly this world was stitched together. It was, by every measure available to us, a golden age. Palaces were centers not just of power, but of administration, recording every transaction, every shipment, every tribute in careful bureaucratic script. Artisans produced luxury goods that traveled thousands of miles from their origin. Diplomacy, marriage alliances, and formal treaties bound these kingdoms into something resembling an international order centuries before such a concept would have a name. This was the height of the late Bronze Age, and within a single human generation, it would come apart. The evidence for what happened lies buried in the earth itself. Archaeologists digging through the layers of dozens of sites across the eastern Mediterranean have found, again and again, the same grim signature, a stratum of ash, a layer of collapsed walls, unburied dead beneath fallen roofs, treasures left behind in the panic of flight. City after city met this fate within the span of a few decades. Ugarit, one of the great trading hubs of the age, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Its final tablets, still unfired in the kiln when the city fell, preserve messages of desperation, pleas for ships, for grain, for help that never arrived. Hattusa, the mighty Hittite capital, was abandoned. Palace after palace across Greece went up in flames. Even the great cities of Cyprus, positioned at the crossroads of the sea trade, did not escape. This was not the fall of a single kingdom to a single enemy. It was something larger, something that swept across an entire interconnected world in a way that has puzzled historians for more than a century. What could bring down an entire system of civilizations that had endured for hundreds of years, seemingly all at once? Part of the answer comes to us from Egypt, the one great power that survived, wounded but intact. On the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, carved in stone and painted in vivid color, is one of the most extraordinary historical records to survive from the ancient world. It describes an attack unlike any Egypt had faced before. Not the incursion of a single rival army, but the arrival of entire peoples on the move, men, women, and children, ox carts loaded with household goods, warriors accompanying what appears to be whole communities in migration, arriving both by land and by a fleet of ships bearing down upon the Egyptian coast. The inscriptions name these newcomers in groups: the Peliset, the Shurden, the Denian, the Shekelesh, the Ekwesh, among others. Ramesses III boasts of a great victory, of a land and sea battle in which his forces broke this confederation and drove them back. Egypt, alone among the great Bronze Age powers, held. But the very fact that Egypt needed to fight this battle at all, and the sheer scale of what the inscriptions describe, tells us that whatever this force was, it was significant enough to threaten even the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world. Modern historians gave this confederation of peoples a name that appears nowhere in the ancient sources themselves: the Sea Peoples. It is a 19th century label, coined by scholars trying to make sense of the Egyptian records, and it has stuck ever since, even as our understanding of who these groups actually were has grown more complicated with each passing decade. We do not know, with certainty, where each of these named peoples originated. Some names appear to echo places we can still identify today, hints of the Aegean, of Anatolia, of the wider Mediterranean world. Others remain far more obscure. What is clear is that they were not a single unified nation, but a loose and shifting coalition, one that seems to have grown as it moved, absorbing displaced groups along the way, a rolling wave of upheaval rather than a single army marching under one banner. And this raises the deeper question that lies at the heart of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Were the Sea Peoples the cause of this widespread destruction, or were they themselves a symptom of something larger already underway? Evidence points to multiple forces converging at once. Long-term drought appears to have gripped the eastern Mediterranean in this period, straining agricultural systems that were already stretched thin, supporting large palace bureaucracies. Earthquakes, some scholars argue, struck a string of cities in rapid succession. Trade routes, so essential to this interconnected world, would have broken down as one link in the chain after another failed, causing shortages and unrest to cascade outward. Internal rebellions against the rigid palace economies may have added to the chaos. Into this atmosphere of scarcity, breakdown, and fear, waves of displaced peoples, perhaps refugees themselves from failing regions, moved in search of new land, new resources, new homes. Whether they were the spark that lit the fire or simply carried the flames further, the effect was the same, an interconnected world unraveling all at once, each collapse feeding the next. It is against this backdrop of systemic collapse that one particular city commands our attention, because its story would outlive every other casualty of this age by thousands of years, carried forward not in the silence of an archaeological layer, but in the living memory of song. On the northwestern coast of Anatolia, at a site now called Hisarlik, archaeologists have uncovered a city built and rebuilt many times across the centuries, one layer stacked upon another like the rings of a tree. Among these layers is one that shows unmistakable signs of violent destruction and fire, dating to this same turbulent window of the Late Bronze Age. Walls collapsed inward. Skeletal remains show signs of a sudden and violent end. Weapons lie scattered where they fell. This layer, identified by archaeologists as Troy Sevena, has become one of the most debated sites in the history of Mediterranean archaeology, precisely because of the question it forces us to confront. Could this be the Troy of legend? Could the burned city beneath this hillside be the same city that would one day be sung about in the halls of Greek nobles? A story of a 10-year siege, a wooden horse, and a war fought over the abduction of a queen? We cannot answer this question with certainty. An honest scholarship demands that we resist the temptation to force a perfect match between myth and soil. But the coincidence is difficult to ignore. A fortified city on a strategic trade route, destroyed by fire, in precisely the era when the entire surrounding world was falling into chaos. If a war was fought here, in this age of collapsing kingdoms and roaming sea peoples, then it was not an isolated tragedy. It was one thread within a far larger unraveling, a single burning city among many, distinguished only by the fact that someone, centuries later, would choose to remember it in verse. The Bronze Age world did not end with a single dramatic battle or a single named enemy. It ended the way a great structure ends when too many of its supports fail at once. Gradually, then suddenly, each collapse accelerating the next, until the great interconnected system that had defined the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries simply ceased to function. Palaces burned, trade routes vanished. Written scripts fell out of use for centuries in some regions, plunging entire societies into what historians once called a dark age. And amid the ash and abandoned cities, populations were set in motion, walking, sailing, searching for new homes in a world that no longer resembled the one their grandparents had known. It is out of this same restless motion, this same age of ships and displacement and burning cities, that one particular story would emerge, a story not of a people, but of a single man cast out onto the wine-dark sea, struggling for years to find his way back to a home that the world itself was making harder and harder to return to. Part 2. Centuries after the fires of the Late Bronze Age had gone cold, after the palaces had crumbled into low mounds of earth and the great trading networks had dissolved into memory, a different kind of record kept the age alive. Not one carved into stone by a pharaoh's scribes, not one baked into clay in a merchant's archive, but one carried instead in the human voice, passed from singer to singer, generation after generation, in the halls of a world that had risen from the wreckage of the one before it. This record was song, and its greatest work, when it was finally set down in writing centuries later, would be called the Odyssey. By the time Homer's verses took the shape we recognize today, the events of the late Bronze Age collapse lay hundreds of years in the past. The poem was not history in any strict sense. It was memory transformed by generations of retelling, shaped and reshaped by singers who added detail, softened some truths, sharpened others, and wove in the marvels and monsters that oral tradition demands to hold an audience's attention. And yet, embedded within this transformed memory are details that feel less like invention and more like residue, fragments of a real and vanished world clinging to the surface of the myth the way salt clings to a hull long after the ship has come ashore. At the center of this residue stands Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a man who fights in a great war on foreign shores and then cannot find his way home. For 10 years he wanders, blown off course, shipwrecked, held captive, robbed of his companions one by one, forced to survive by his wits in a world that seems determined to keep him from the hearth he left behind. It is tempting to read the Odyssey purely as fantasy, a tale of witches and cyclopes and vengeful gods. But strip away the supernatural elements, and what remains is something startlingly familiar to the world we explored in the previous chapter of this story. A warrior separated from his homeland, a man reduced to raiding coastal settlements for supplies, a fleet scattered by storm and circumstance, a hero forced again and again to identify himself to strangers, to explain who he is and where he comes from, because he has been cut loose from every structure that once defined him. These are not merely the trials of one legendary king. They are, in miniature, the exact conditions that swept across the eastern Mediterranean in the age of collapse. Displacement, improvised survival, the breakdown of the old order that once told a person where they belonged. Homer's audience, generations removed from the actual Bronze Age catastrophe, would still have inherited a cultural memory of a world where the sea could suddenly become a place of danger and dislocation rather than safe passage, where a man could set out as a warrior and return, if he returned at all, as something closer to a wandering exile. It is worth pausing here to be precise about what we can and cannot claim. No serious historian argues that the Odyssey is a coded historical document, a puzzle box hiding literal facts about the sea peoples beneath its verses. The poem is a work of art, shaped by centuries of oral performance, and its purpose was never to record events with the precision of an inscription at Medinet Habu. But scholars have long noted intriguing points of contact between the world Homer describes and the world revealed by archaeology and Egyptian records. From the era of collapse, points of contact worth examining carefully, without overstating what they prove. Consider the names. Among the confederation that Rameses III battled on the shores of Egypt was a people the Egyptians recorded as the Danaan. Some scholars have proposed a connection between this name and the Danaans, one of the terms Homer uses again and again to refer to the Greeks who sailed against Troy. If this connection holds, and it remains genuinely debated among historians rather than settled fact, it would suggest something remarkable, that the very Greeks whose war Homer sang about may themselves have been remembered from the Egyptian side of the Mediterranean as one of the groups swept up in this age of upheaval. The besiegers of Troy and the raiders who struck Egypt's shores would not be separate stories from separate worlds, but different chapters of the very same disruption, viewed from opposite ends of the sea. Other names in the Egyptian inscriptions offer their own threads to follow. The Shurdan, warriors named among the sea peoples, appear in Egyptian records not only as attackers but eventually as mercenaries, fighting in the very armies of the pharaohs who had once repelled them. This detail matters because it reminds us that the story of the sea peoples was never simply one of invaders against defenders. It was a story of populations in motion, adapting, some settling into new roles as hired soldiers, others pushing onward in search of land, others still absorbed into the very societies they had once threatened. This is not the clean narrative of myth, with clear heroes and clear enemies. It is the messier, more human reality of an age when identity itself was being renegotiated on every shore of the Mediterranean. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of the Peliset, a name recorded again and again in the Egyptian inscriptions among the Confederation of Sea Peoples. Unlike so many of the other groups named in these ancient records, whose ultimate fate fades into obscurity, the path of the Peliset can be traced forward with real confidence. They settled along the coast of Canaan, in the region that would come to bear their name in a form we still recognize today, Philistia. The Philistines, so often remembered through the later lens of their conflicts with ancient Israel, appear to have begun their history in this region as one of the very peoples swept up in the collapse of the Bronze Age world, a group whose migration did not end in myth or mystery, but in a real, geographically anchored settlement whose archaeological remains still speak to us today, in distinctive pottery styles and material culture that echo the Aegean world they may have left behind. Here we find a striking contrast worth holding up against the story of Odysseus himself. Where the Philistines' journey ends in a real place, on a real map, backed by real excavated cities, Odysseus's journey ends nowhere but in the poem itself, in the timeless returning of a hero to a hearth that exists only in the world of story. One is history, however incomplete our knowledge of its details. The other is myth, however rich its correspondence to the historical moment that produced it. And yet both journeys share the same essential shape. A people, or a person, set loose from their former place in the world, driven across the sea by forces beyond their control, searching for a new foothold, whether that foothold is a literal stretch of coastline in Canaan or a symbolic return to a remembered home in Ithaca. This is, in the end, the deeper value of placing the Odyssey alongside the history of the sea peoples. Not to prove that Homer secretly recorded real events, and not to reduce a great work of literature to a footnote in an archaeological report. Rather, it is to recognize that the Odyssey gives emotional and human shape to an experience that the historical record can only describe from the outside. The Egyptian inscriptions tell us that peoples moved, that ships came, that battles were fought and won and lost. They do not tell us what it felt like to be aboard one of those ships, uncertain of what shore would greet you next, uncertain if home even still existed in any recognizable form behind you. For that, we have only the poem. And the poem, whatever liberties it takes, whatever monsters and gods it introduces along the way, preserves something the inscriptions cannot: the interior experience of an age of displacement, carried forward not as fact, but as feeling. The Mediterranean of this era, then, was not one world at war with another, nor a simple story of invaders and defenders. It was a sea crossed in every direction by people who no longer knew, with any certainty, where they belonged. Warriors became raiders, raiders became mercenaries, refugees became settlers. And somewhere in the midst of all this movement, one story, the story of a king trying against every obstacle to return to the wife, the son, and the home he had left behind, was being told and retold around fires, in halls, on ships, until at last it was fixed into the form we still read today. If the sea peoples give us the outer shape of this age, the sails on the horizon, the burning cities, the names carved into temple walls, then Odysseus gives us its inner shape, the fear, the longing, the sheer stubborn will to find a way home when the world itself has conspired to make that impossible. Neither the history nor the myth is complete without the other, and it is in the space between them, between what the stone remembers and what the song remembers, that the true shape of this vanished age begins, finally, to come into focus. Part 3. Every civilization that survives catastrophe must eventually answer a quiet but insistent question. How does a people carry forward the memory of a world that no longer exists? Stone crumbles. Palaces fall into rubble and are forgotten beneath centuries of soil. Written scripts, tied to the very bureaucracies that collapsed alongside the palaces that used them, can vanish from a region for hundreds of years. And yet, something else persists. Something that requires no clay tablet and no temple wall to survive. The spoken word, carried from one generation to the next in the rhythm of song. This is the quiet miracle at the heart of the Odyssey. In the centuries after the late Bronze Age collapse, much of the eastern Mediterranean fell into a period of such profound disruption that later Greek writers themselves would look back on it as a dark and half-forgotten age. Literacy nearly disappeared in Greece for a span of centuries. The grand palace centers that once organized economic and political life were gone, and with them the administrative writing system that had recorded their daily transactions. And yet, even as the material world of the Bronze Age vanished into ruin, its memory did not vanish with it. It survived instead in the practice of oral poetry, carried by singers whose entire craft was built around holding vast quantities of story and memory and passing it forward, performance after performance, until literacy returned and someone, at last, wrote it down. This is why the Odyssey deserves to be read not simply as entertainment, but as an act of cultural preservation, however imperfect and however transformed by the centuries of retelling that shaped it. A society that has lived through systemic collapse does not usually produce stories about stability and peace. It produces stories about survival, about journeys undertaken against impossible odds, about the terror of a world that no longer follows familiar rules. The Odyssey is soaked in precisely this anxiety. Sea monsters lurk in unfamiliar waters. Strangers on foreign shores may offer hospitality or violence, and the hero can never be entirely sure which he will receive. Home itself, the one fixed point the entire poem strains toward, is under threat even in the hero's absence, occupied by suitors who assume he will never return. This is not the architecture of a comfortable myth. It is the architecture of a trauma, refracted through generations of storytelling until it became art. Understood this way, the Odyssey functions as something close to a coping mechanism operating at the scale of an entire culture. The actual mechanics of the Bronze Age collapse, the drought, the earthquakes, the breakdown of trade, the migrations of peoples whom the Egyptians recorded as a confederation of raiders, were far too vast and impersonal for any single story to capture. But a single wandering king, fighting to return to his wife and his throne, gave that vast impersonal disaster a human face and a human stake. Where the historical record offers scale, the myth offers intimacy. Where the inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe armies and fleets, the poem describes one man, alone on a raft, watching his ship break apart beneath him. Civilizations do not usually process catastrophe through statistics. They process it through characters, and the Odyssey gave the trauma of an entire age a name, a face, and a home to long for. None of this means we should treat the poem as a literal transcript of events, and honest scholarship requires us to hold two truths at once. On one hand, the correspondences we have traced across this documentary are genuinely striking. Names in the Egyptian inscriptions that echo names in Homer, a pattern of displacement and raiding and resettlement in the historical record that mirrors the pattern of Odysseus's own trials, an actual historical people, the Philistines, whose migration follows the same Mediterranean currents that carry Homer's hero from shore to shore. On the other hand, historians remain divided, and reasonably so, about how much weight these correspondences can bear. Some scholars argue that the parallels are too specific, too numerous to be coincidence, and that the Homeric tradition preserves a genuine folk memory of the late Bronze Age collapse, however distorted by centuries of retelling. Others urge greater caution, noting that oral epic tends to generate exactly these kinds of resonances on its own, through the universal themes of war, wandering, and homecoming that appear across countless unrelated cultures and eras, with no need for a specific historical trigger. Both positions rest on serious scholarship, and neither should be dismissed in favor of a simpler, more satisfying story. What we can say with confidence is this: the two records we have explored, the archaeological and the epic, the inscription and the song, converge on the same underlying truth about this age, even if they cannot be perfectly mapped onto one another point by point. Something happened across the Mediterranean world at the end of the Bronze Age that shattered the old order of kingdoms and trade routes. Populations were set in motion by forces beyond their control, whether drought, famine, war, or the simple collapse of the systems that had once sustained them. Some of those populations left a trace we can still excavate, like the Philistines settling into Canaan. Others left a trace we can still sing, in the wanderings of a king who could not find his way home. Both are witnesses to the same catastrophe, speaking in different languages, one carved in stone and pottery, the other carried in meter and verse. And this brings us finally to the reason this ancient story continues to matter so many centuries later. Strip away the specific names, the specific ships, the specific gods hurling storms across a specific sea, and what remains is a story that could belong to almost any age of upheaval in human history. A person or a people, forced from their home by circumstances beyond their control. A long and uncertain passage across dangerous and unfamiliar territory. A desperate hope, carried through every trial, that somewhere ahead lies a place that can be called home again. This is not only the story of Odysseus. It is not only the story of the Pelasets settling into Canaan, or the Sheridan finding new roles as soldiers in a foreign army. It is a story that has repeated itself again and again across human history, Wherever war, disaster, or the simple failure of a system forces people to leave behind everything they once knew in search of a future they cannot yet see. The scholars who study the late Bronze Age collapse are, in a sense, doing the same work as the ancient singers who first composed the Odyssey. Both are trying to give shape and meaning to an event too vast to hold in the mind all at once. The archaeologist sifts through layers of ash to reconstruct the sequence of a catastrophe. The poet, centuries closer to the event but with far less precision, sifts through inherited fragments of memory to reconstruct its emotional truth. Neither approach alone gives us the full picture. Together, they offer something more valuable than either could alone: a portrait of an age of collapse that is at once historically grounded and humanly comprehensible. An age we can locate on a map, and an age we can feel in the chest of a man straining toward a shore he fears he will never reach. It would be easy to end this story here, safely enclosed within the ancient world, a curiosity from 3,000 years in the past. But the value of this story lies precisely in its refusal to stay in the past. Every age of upheaval since has produced its own displaced peoples, its own wanderers searching for a home that war or disaster has taken from them, its own stories told and retold to make sense of loss too large to comprehend directly. The specific names change, the ships change, the gods, if they appear at all, change. But the underlying human pattern, displacement, endurance, and the long, uncertain search for home remains remarkably constant across the centuries. This, in the end, is what the story of the Sea Peoples and the story of Odysseus share most deeply, more than any specific name in an Egyptian inscription, more than any single archaeological layer of ash. Both are testimonies to the same enduring truth about civilization itself, that even when the world falls apart, even when kingdoms burn and trade routes vanish and the old order gives way entirely to chaos, people do not simply disappear into that chaos. They move, they adapt, they remember. And in the songs and settlements they leave behind, however scattered across the shores of history, they tell us the same thing, again and again, in every language and every age: that the search for home is the oldest journey there is. And it is a journey that, in one form or another, every civilization that has ever faced catastrophe has had to undertake.